Jack Riley resides on his porch in Ohio, a weathered throne from which he observes the slow march of seasons. At 89, his world has shrunk to the dimensions of this wooden enclosure, a fortress meticulously constructed not of timber and nails, but of profound silence and rigid routine. Every drop of rain that darkens the planks is not a promise of renewal, but an unnerving echo from a lifetime ago, carrying a phantom scent from the frozen earth of Korea. That scent speaks not of life and growth, but of a stillness too deep to comprehend. His fingers, gnarled and twisted like the roots of an ancient oak, find their constant restless occupation with a worn St. Christopher medal. It is not an object of faith or a source of comfort. Instead, it is the ghost of a broken promise, the last tangible piece of a father who walked away into the bleak, hungry landscape of the Great Depression. He left behind only the cold weight of this metal and a son who would become ferociously determined to be everything his father was not. On this single, unyielding principle that he would never be the man who runs, Jack built an entire existence. He wore the Marine uniform with a grim, unsmiling pride, enduring horrors in a foreign land so he could plant his feet firmly back on American soil. He returned, married, and raised a family, providing a steadfast, unwavering presence that his own childhood so desperately lacked. His whole life became a carefully curated monument to stability, a quiet, stubborn defiance against the inherited legacy of abandonment. Yet, the very foundation of this monument has a fissure, a hairline crack that spiders out from a single agonizing moment in a long-ago winter. It is a secret he guards with a vigilance that has never waned, a story buried deep beneath the permafrost of his memory. The rain, the cold, the metallic scent in the air, they are all keys threatening to unlock a door he bolted shut decades ago. His silence is a shield, colder and more impenetrable than any Ohio frost, protecting a single, fragile truth. The porch is his fortress, but also his prison, where the man who swore never to run must eternally face the memory of a choice he made in the snow, a memory that has been chasing him ever since. For more powerful stories of ordinary people with extraordinary secrets, subscribe. We delve into the moments that define a life. Join us to uncover the hidden truths that haunt the human heart. My morning has a certain rhythm. The gurgle of the coffee maker, the soft thud of the newspaper on the porch, the slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It's a quiet life, one I've carefully built over decades, brick by silent brick. But today, a new sound cuts through the peace. The crisp, tearing sound of an envelope. It's not a bill, not a card from a friend. The letterhead is stark, official, Department of Defense. My heart gives a single, hard thump against my ribs, a drumbeat for a war I thought was over. My hands, usually steady, tremble slightly as I unfold the paper. And there it is. A name I've buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it belonged to a ghost in a book I once read. Corporal David Miller. The name hits me like a physical shock, a jolt of ice water. Miller. I see him instantly, the too loud laugh, the easy, confident grin that never faltered, the way he moved like he owned whatever patch of frozen earth we stood on. He was everything I wasn't. A walking, talking reminder of all my own quiet fears and gnawing insecurities. The letter is a summons, its formal language a cold key turning a rusted lock in my mind. Suddenly, I'm not in my sunlit kitchen anymore. I'm blinded by the glare of sun on endless snow, deafened by the eerie, profound quiet of the Korean hills. And I see him, not Miller, but the boy. The small, dark-haired boy with wide, terrified eyes that swallowed the whole world. "Dad, what is it?" Sarah's voice pulls me back across the years. She's standing in the doorway, her brow furrowed with a gentle concern that feels like a spotlight. She sees it, of course. She sees the walls I've just rebuilt around myself, taller and thicker than before. I fold the letter with deliberate, slow movements, smoothing the crease as if I could smooth away the past itself. I force my face into a neutral mask, a blankness I perfected long ago. "Nothing," I say, the word tasting like ash. "Just old business." The silence in the car was a heavy blanket, disturbed only by the rhythmic thump of tires on the Ohio highway. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, her hands steady on the wheel, granting him the space he clearly needed. For Jack, the world outside the window was a meaningless blur of green and grey. With every passing mile marker, the asphalt dissolved into a dusty, rutted track, and the hum of the engine deepened into the familiar, bone-jarring rumble of a military transport truck. The cold was what he remembered most vividly, a damp, insidious chill that seeped through the layers of his uniform and settled deep in his marrow. He could almost feel the hard bench beneath him and Miller's presence beside him, without even looking. It wasn't friendship, not really, but a constant low-level friction, a current of rivalry that ran between them. A sarcastic remark about a dirty rifle, a silent competition to see who could stomach the rations without complaint. It was a language only they spoke, a necessary distraction that kept their minds sharp and walled off the crushing, soul-deep isolation of their post. Now, decades later, the ghost of that rivalry felt more real than the leather seat beneath him. The life he had built since then felt like a fiction, a carefully constructed narrative of peace and normalcy he repeated to himself each morning until he almost believed it. It was a story with entire chapters ripped out, the pages smoothed over to hide the tears. Today, he was being summoned to read that story aloud, to expose the missing pages and the fragile binding to a room of strangers. As Sarah guided the car into a parking space, the regional government building loomed, an imposing structure of glass and steel that reflected the overcast sky with cold indifference. His hand slipped into his pocket, his fingers closing around the worn, familiar shape of his St. Christopher medal. The cool metal was a small, solid anchor in a sea of dread. The quiet hiss of the automatic doors opening was like a starting gun, and as he crossed the threshold, he felt as though he was stepping onto a field he thought he had left behind forever. The official he had come to see, Evelyn Reed, was not the stern, bespectacled man he had anticipated. Instead, a young woman with a kind, patient face sat across from him, her presence calming in the quiet, document-filled room. She didn't press or pry. Her questions were simple, straightforward inquiries about his unit, the day-to-day conditions, the logistics of their movements. Each question, however gentle, was a cue for Jack to begin the performance he had been preparing for the better part of a century. He drew a steadying breath and began to deliver the version of the story he had rehearsed in his mind until it was smooth and seamless. A narrative of duty and difficult circumstances, a chronicle from which all the messy human parts had been painstakingly excised. He spoke of camaraderie and shared hardship, painting a portrait of soldiers who did what was required of them. No more, no less. "Miller was a good soldier," Jack stated, the words feeling foreign and cloying in his mouth, a well-rehearsed lie that suddenly lost its conviction. The phrase, meant to be a simple closing platitude, instead acted as a switch. In an instant, his mind was not on the frozen ridges of Korea, but wrenched back to the sweltering, dusty parade ground of basic training. He was no longer an old man in a quiet archive, but a young, rigid Corporal Riley, a man whose worldview was a stark, unyielding landscape of black and white. For Riley, there was only the right way and the wrong way, the regulation and the infraction. There was no in-between. Then he saw Miller, as clear as if he were standing there, a man who seemed to inhabit all the shades of grey that Riley so vehemently denied. Miller, with his casual posture and a worldview that could bend without breaking, was a constant challenge to the corporal's rigid authority. Their clash was not one of open insubordination, but of two fundamentally opposed philosophies, a friction of personalities that predated any real combat. As the memory faded and he looked back at Evelyn's compassionate eyes, the chasm between the sterile account he was giving and the vibrant, complicated truth he remembered felt impossibly vast. Ms. Reed's movements are precise as she unfolds the large, topographical map across the polished surface of the table. The aged paper crackles, a fragile sound in the quiet, sterile office. The intricate contour lines and faded colors depict the unforgiving terrain of the Chosin Reservoir, a geography of past trauma rendered in ink. "Can you show me the location of the patrol where Corporal Miller was last seen?" she asks, her voice soft but carrying a clinical weight that Jack finds unnerving. His hand, gnarled and spotted with age, hovers over the map for a long moment, a slight tremor running through his fingers. When his index finger finally descends, the contact is electric. As it traces a faint, penciled-in route across the brittle paper, the hushed air of the room thickens and grows cold. The scent of antiseptic cleaner and old files is scoured away by the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder on the wind. The fluorescent lights overhead dim into a leaden sky, and the polished table dissolves into a crust of frozen, snow-dusted earth. He is no longer in an office. He is back there, the biting wind a physical entity, slicing at his exposed skin, the weight of his M1 Garand a familiar burden. He is arguing with Miller, whose youthful face is flushed with a frustrating, unshakable confidence that seemed to defy the very landscape they occupied. Miller stabs a gloved finger towards the mouth of a low-lying valley. "Through the valley is a straight shot, Riley," he had insisted, his breath forming a cloud of defiant vapor. "We're in and out before they even know we're there. A ghost patrol." Jack, who was only ever Riley back then, had shaken his head, the fear a cold, solid knot in his gut. "Over the ridge is smarter," he had countered, his voice low and tight, trying to convey a wisdom born not of courage, but of profound terror. "It gives us the high ground, a better vantage point. It's slower but smarter." Their entire relationship was encapsulated in that single stark disagreement. Miller's bold, almost reckless self-assurance against Jack's cautious, overthinking fear. Miller saw a shortcut to completing the mission. Jack saw an open killing field, a perfect channel for an ambush where they'd be silhouetted against the snow. It had always been this way between them. Miller charging forward, fueled by an innate belief in his own luck and the righteousness of speed. Jack holding back, calculating the odds, seeing enemy ghosts in the skeletal branches of every frozen tree. Jack felt he was trying to save Miller from his own bravado. Miller surely saw him as an anchor of cowardice, a dead weight slowing them down from the glory they were owed. Back in the office, he can no longer perceive. Jack's finger comes to a halt at the entrance to that valley. The memory is so vivid, he can see Miller's dismissive grin, a final flash of white in the oppressive grey landscape, as he turned and headed down that path alone, his silhouette shrinking against the vast, indifferent snow. Ms. Reed's question hangs unanswered in the air, but his trembling finger, resting on that fateful spot, has told her everything she needs to know. The memory persists, etched with a stark clarity that time cannot dull. The village materialized before them as a ghost of what it once was, its silence as profound and complete as the rumors had promised. Wind whispered through the skeletal frames of collapsed roofs and doorways that gaped like mouths in a silent scream. It was a place where life had been scoured away, leaving only echoes. Yet, from the rubble of a single, particularly devastated hut, a faint sound defied the emptiness, a soft, rhythmic whimper that drew them closer. Inside, the shadows clung to two small figures. A boy, Minjun, was crouched protectively over his sister, Sujin, whose small frame trembled with a feverish heat that was palpable even from a distance. When the boy looked up, his eyes were ancient. They were not the eyes of a child. Devoid of tears, they held a profound weariness, a chilling acceptance of a world that had taken everything. It was a gaze that spoke of shouldering burdens far too heavy for his young back. For Jack, That look was a key turning a lock deep within him. An old walled-off chamber of his own memory was thrown open, revealing the ghost of a lonely boy left behind when his own father had walked away. The ache of that long-ago abandonment resonated with the desolation in Min Jun's eyes. The connection was instantaneous, primal. Before a conscious thought could form, Jack's hands were moving, unbuckling his pack and pulling out the last of his own rations. He knelt, extending the small packet to the boy without a word. Miller, poised on the threshold with a cynical joke already forming on his lips, stopped dead. The jest died in his throat as he witnessed the quiet, solemn exchange. He watched Jack, his rival, act not from strategy or duty, but from a place of raw, unvarnished empathy. The sight silenced him completely. In that shared moment of stillness, as Jack looked up, he met Miller's gaze. For the first time, the familiar glint of competition was gone. In its place was something new and unexpected. A flicker of profound understanding, an acknowledgement of their shared humanity in the face of such small, immense suffering. A fragile truce was declared in the ruins, forged not in words, but in the profound quiet of a single selfless act. The uneasy truce he had brokered with the ghosts of his past proved to be a delicate thing, easily broken by a single, unexpected piece of evidence. Back in the sterile quiet of the present, Evelyn Reed's gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of decades. She slid a photograph across the polished table toward Jack. Her voice was gentle as she spoke. This was found among the personal effects. The image was of a small, crudely carved wooden bird. For Jack, the air in the room thinned, his breath catching in his throat. The world tilted on its axis, and he was no longer an old man in a quiet room, but a young soldier watching his friend, Min Jun, whittle that very same bird with a dull knife. It was a small act of defiance, a way to pass the terrifying endless hours and carve a sliver of normalcy from the chaos surrounding them. But the bird had been found with Miller's belongings. The name, a ghost he thought long buried, resurfaced with shocking force. A single devastating question took root in his mind, its tendrils wrapping around the foundations of the story he had carried for 70 years, threatening to pull it all down. Why did Miller have it? Jack returned home, but a part of him remained tethered to the afternoon's haunting vision. The image of the bird, vibrant and impossible, was seared behind his eyes, replaying itself against the backdrop of mundane household sounds. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, his presence a mere shadow, the connection to his own life feeling frayed and distant. Sleep offered no escape. As darkness settled over the house, the restlessness grew into a palpable need. Driven by an impulse he didn't fully comprehend, Jack descended the creaking wooden stairs into the basement. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and time. In the far corner, under a mound of faded blankets, lay the object of his search. With a grunt of effort, he pulled the heavy, dust-covered footlocker into the bare light of the single hanging bulb. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the lid. He sank to the cold concrete floor, the contents spreading around him like artifacts from another man's life. There were the old photos, stiff and curled at the edges, capturing a younger, leaner version of himself with a smile that now seemed foreign. A service medal, nestled in its velvet box, gleamed dully, its weight a poor substitute for the memories it was supposed to represent. Beside it, a crisply folded flag, a sacred relic of a duty fulfilled. These were the props, the carefully curated evidence for the hero story his family had been told and he had let them believe. He sifted through them, his fingers tracing the edges of photographs and the cold metal of the medal, searching for an answer. He was looking for something, anything, that could explain the bird, a clue that would make sense of the visceral horror it had stirred within him. But there was nothing here. The footlocker held only the tidy, sanitized narrative of a man who did his duty and came home whole. The story was clean, honorable, and utterly devoid of the chaos that now churned inside him. He was so lost in the hollow relics that he didn't hear Sarah on the stairs until her shadow fell over him. She stopped on the last step, taking in the scene. Her husband, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of a past she thought she knew. "I don't understand," he whispered, the words barely audible, spoken more to the scattered memories than to her. He shook his head, his gaze lost somewhere between the folded flag and the haunting image in his mind. It doesn't make sense. The story had come undone, leaving him adrift in a silence the medal and the photos could no longer fill. He can no longer suppress the memory. The truth of that final day, etched in ice and wind, always forces its way back into his thoughts. His mind surrenders to the pull, plunging him into the heart of the chaos. It was not the thunder of enemy artillery that had shattered their formation, but a force far more absolute and indifferent. A sudden, vicious blizzard had descended like a shroud, collapsing their supply lines and turning the world into a blinding white void. The order that crackled through the radios was sharp with panic. Evacuate immediately. What followed was a desperate scramble, a frantic surge of bodies toward the salvation of the last trucks grinding their way through the deepening snow. It was amidst this swirling pandemonium that Jack and Miller found them. The two men, whose careers had been a long story of bitter rivalry, saw the small shapes of Min-jun and Soo-jin huddled by a frozen crate, their young faces pale with a fear that went beyond the cold. In the heart of the storm, their eyes met over the heads of the children. No word was spoken, none was needed. The years of animosity between them evaporated in that single shared glance. A new, silent mission formed, an unspoken pact to shield these children from the indifferent fury of nature. Their rivalry dissolved, replaced by a single, unified purpose forged in the howling wind. The air at the makeshift evacuation point was thick with desperation and swirling snow. Each gust of wind carried the cries of the hopeless, a mournful chorus against which a lone officer's voice fought to maintain order. His face, chapped raw by the cold, was a mask of strained authority as he yelled until his throat was ragged, making impossible calculations of space and humanity. Finally, his voice cracked with finality, a decree that cut through the chaos. No more room, just the children. Through the frantic press of bodies, Jack and David Miller pushed forward, a protective unit around the small, silent form of Min-jun. The child was a ghost in their arms, his fear a palpable weight. "They can't go alone!" Miller's shout was a desperate challenge hurled into the wind, a plea for reason in a world gone mad. For a fleeting moment, the officer's rigid posture faltered. His gaze, weary and haunted, scanned their faces, saw the child, and conceded a sliver of ground. He pointed a trembling, gloved finger toward the last departing truck. "Fine. One of you," he barked, the words torn from him. "That's all I have space for. Now move." The world seemed to fracture in that split second. A protest, hot and indignant, rose in Jack's throat. He was ready to argue, to insist on the impossible, that they all stay or all go, that they would not be broken apart. But before he could utter a word, Miller's decision was made with a sudden, forceful shove. The push sent Jack stumbling forward, propelling him and Min-jun toward the offered salvation. Amidst the pandemonium, Miller's voice was a strange island of calm. "Go," he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "You're better with him." The heavy tailgate slammed shut with a deafening metallic finality, severing their world in two. As the truck lurched away, its tires spinning for purchase in the snow, Jack scrambled to the grimy rear window. His last sight of David Miller was a portrait of sacrifice, an image seared into his memory. There Miller stood, alone, a steadfast figure against the chaotic white, growing smaller and smaller until the swirling snow consumed him entirely. Jack had faced down enemies and never backed away from a fight. But on that day, he hadn't run from a fight. He had been pushed away from an impossible choice, and the crushing guilt of that moment became his constant shadow, a cold reminder of the man he left behind. Jack sat opposite Miss Reed, the polished mahogany of her desk a placid sea between them. He felt a similar calm within himself, a practiced stillness he had cultivated for years. This was the final statement, the last time he would need to recount the story. He had rehearsed it so many times, both in his head and to others, that the lie had hardened into something resembling truth. The wind, the blinding snow, the final stoic acceptance in Corporal Miller's eyes as Jack was forced to leave him behind. It was a tragic, heroic tale, one that painted Jack as a grim survivor, a man haunted but unbroken. He was ready to deliver it one last time, to finally lay the ghost of Miller to rest in the cold official archives. He cleared his throat, ready to begin the familiar cadence. The storm came on us faster than we— "One moment, Mr. Riley," Ms. Reed interrupted, her voice gentle but firm enough to cut through his prepared narrative. She didn't look up at him, her attention fixed on a thin manila folder she slid from a drawer. It was different from the thick file already open on her desk, the one that contained his entire history. This one was new. It felt dangerous. She opened it, her gaze scanning the single page within. The air in the quiet office suddenly felt thin, charged. "Mr. Riley," she began, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone one might use to deliver a terrible diagnosis. "Our intelligence suggests something different about the events of that day." Jack's heart began a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. The calm was gone, replaced by a cold dread. "Corporal Miller wasn't lost to the storm," she continued, finally lifting her eyes to meet his. "They were clear, professional, offering no comfort. We have unconfirmed reports, of course, but the source is credible. A group of survivors, including an American soldier matching Miller's description, were apparently taken in by missionaries." The words hung in the space between them. Missionaries. It was a detail so impossibly random, so far outside the confines of his story, that it felt like a fiction more elaborate than his own. Ms. Reed wasn't finished. "They lived for many years, it seems, in a remote mountain settlement, completely cut off from the outside world. The air didn't just feel thin, it vanished. It was sucked from Jack's lungs, leaving a hollow, aching void. The image he had of Miller, frozen peacefully in the snow, a quick and merciful end, evaporated like a mirage. In its place, a new vision bloomed with horrifying clarity. Miller alive. Miller surviving day after day, year after year, in a harsh, isolated world. Miller perhaps wondering, always wondering, why no one came for him. He didn't just leave Miller to a quick, cold end. He left him to a long, hard life of exile, a life of struggle and loneliness while he, Jack, came home. He came home to parades and sympathy, to a wife and children, to warm beds, and a life of comfortable peace built upon that single defining lie. The carefully constructed facade of the stoic survivor, the man who did what he had to do, didn't just crack. It detonated. It shattered into a million sharp, glittering pieces, and in the reflection of each one, he saw the truth of what he was. Not a hero, not a survivor, a coward. The silence that filled the office was a different kind now. It wasn't the respectful quiet of a sad story told. It was the vast, screaming emptiness of a man whose entire identity had just been annihilated. The ghost of Miller was no longer at rest. It was standing right behind him, and its suffering had only just begun. That evening, the world seemed to weep with him. Rain fell in steady, grey sheets, drumming a somber, relentless rhythm on the porch roof where he sat with Sarah. A chasm of unspoken words, carved out by years of emotional distance, had long stretched between them. But tonight, the silence was different. It was heavy, expectant, and as fragile as glass. Jack stared out into the descending gloom, his knuckles white where he gripped the wooden armrest, the grain digging into his palm. The storm outside was a pale reflection of the tempest that had been raging inside him for a lifetime, a secret hurricane of shame and fear. Then it happened. A single hot tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracing a path of shocking warmth down his weathered, unaccustomed cheek. It was a betrayal of a lifetime's resolve. It was followed by another and another, until the rigid dam of his composure, built stone by stone over decades of stoic masculinity, finally broke. The sobs that racked his body were foreign, guttural sounds from a place deep within, a pain so old he had forgotten its source. For the first time in his daughter's life, Jack let her see him utterly, terrifyingly broken. The words, when they came, tumbled out in a ragged, breathless torrent as if released from an immense pressure that had threatened to crush his soul. He confessed the petty, ugly jealousy that had gnawed at him for years, the way he'd watched Miller move through the world with an easy, confident charm that felt like a personal rebuke, a constant reminder of everything he wasn't. He spoke of the truck, the incident that had become a public monument to his failure. He described the crushing weight of that memory, the townsfolk's knowing glances, and the way the feeling of being judged and found wanting had cemented itself deep in his bones. His voice dropped to a near whisper, raw with the shame of his deepest secret. He confessed the fear, the one that had haunted his every decision, that in one critical moment of hesitation, he had failed the ultimate test of character. He had become the very thing he swore he never would, the man who runs. The ghost of his own father, a man defined by his abandonment, loomed in the space between his words. Just like him, he choked out, the admission costing him a piece of his pride, but freeing a part of his spirit. Sarah listened, her gaze unwavering in the dim light. She offered no easy platitudes, no hollow excuses designed to absolve him. When his confession finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she simply reached across the space that separated them and took his large, calloused, trembling hand in her own. Her touch was not one of pity, but of profound, unshakable acceptance. It was a lifeline thrown across the chasm of his isolation, a quiet, sturdy bridge built in an instant over a lifetime of secrets. In the raw, terrifying vulnerability of his confession, as the rain began to soften to a gentle patter, Jack felt an impossible, unexpected lightness. The weight was gone, not erased, but shared, and in its place, a fragile peace began to bloom. He walks into Evelyn Reed's office the next day, a different man. The stoic mask he wore like a second skin has vanished, and in its place is a quiet, settled resolve. The rigidity in his shoulders is gone, the guarded look in his eyes replaced by a clear purpose. He doesn't wait for her to speak. "I need to change my statement," he says, his voice steady and firm in the still room. What follows is not a correction, but a confession, a final act of loyalty. He lays bare the unvarnished truth of Miller's final moments, unraveling the fabricated story he has lived with for decades. It's no longer a hollow tale of a soldier gone missing, a loose end in a forgotten conflict. Instead, he paints a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a hero's split-second, selfless choice. With painstaking detail, he ensures Reed understands the crucial distinction. Miller wasn't abandoned or lost to the chaos. He chose to stay behind, a deliberate sacrifice to save the others. He owes his friend that truth, a debt of honor that has haunted his every waking moment. When he finally falls silent, the last word hanging in the air, a profound change settles over him. A weight he has carried for a lifetime, a burden so old it had become a part of him, simply lifts. He feels it in the newfound ease of his breath, in the release of a tension he didn't even realize he was holding. Reed looks at him, her professional gaze softened by a deep and genuine respect for the courage it took to tell this story. "Thank you, Mr. Riley," she says softly. "The record will show his courage." She lets the statement settle before her expression shifts slightly. "There is just one more thing we recovered." The air in the room was sterile and still, thick with the silence of decades-old questions. Across the cold metal table, a small, clear plastic bag slid into the stark circle of light cast from the overhead lamp. The movement was deliberate, pushing a tarnished, silver-colored locket toward the man seated opposite. Inside the bag, the object looked like a forgotten relic, its surface clouded with the dark patina of age. Reed, her expression a careful mask of professional detachment, had pushed the bag across the table. When Jack made no move, his hands resting motionless on his lap, she sighed softly and retrieved the evidence herself. Her hands, sheathed in thin latex gloves, handled the locket with a surgeon's care. It felt weightless, yet carried the gravity of a lifetime. With a practiced, gentle pressure from her thumbnail, the tiny clasp gave way with a faint click. It swung open, revealing two empty, concave ovals. There was no faded photograph, no miniature portrait of a loved one. Instead, nestled securely in the small, worn hollow, was a St. Christopher medal. The features of the patron saint of travelers had been smoothed and softened by the constant touch of a thumb, the details nearly erased by time and friction. A jolt went through Jack. His own hand instinctively went to his pocket, the familiar cool weight of its identical twin, a sudden shocking anchor to this unbelievable moment. He had carried his for a lifetime, a memento of the man he thought had left him. Reed finally broke the profound silence, her voice barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were fragile. "The remains we found," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "They weren't Corporal Miller's." Jack's breath caught in his throat. Reed let the statement settle, a demolition charge placed at the foundation of his history. The dental records were a dead end for military personnel. For weeks, the file was a ghost, a John Doe from a forgotten war. So on a long shot, we widened the search parameters. We checked them against civilian contractors working in the area during that time. Her gloved hand moved once more, sliding one last piece of paper from a folder and pushing it toward him. It was a copy of a work file, stark and official. Jack's eyes were drawn to the name, typed in bold letters at the top, Thomas Riley. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The room seemed to shrink, the sounds fading until all that existed was that paper and the name of the father he never knew. Reed's voice cut through the haze, now laced with a quiet, profound empathy. "Your father didn't abandon you, Jack. He went to Korea to find work. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time." The words were an absolution, a key turning in a lock rusted shut by 30 years of resentment and pain, finally setting a story free. The world tilts on its axis, a slow, seismic shift that cracks the very foundation of Jack's life. The defining wound, the central betrayal that had been the dark architect of his every action, is revealed for what it truly was: a story. It was a fiction he had painstakingly constructed over decades, a narrative shield to make sense of an absence too vast and silent to comprehend. His father, Thomas Riley, was not the villain who had been escalated in the long personal drama of Jack's mind. He wasn't a coward or a traitor, a spectre to rage against in the dark. He was simply a man who had lost his way, swallowed whole by the fog and noise of a war that had ended for everyone except him. The man Jack had spent a lifetime hating was a ghost, a mirage created to fill a father-shaped void with something tangible, even if that something was anger. In the echoing silence of the archive room, the weight of this new reality oppresses, dense and suffocating. Jack's gaze lands on the two medals resting on the polished mahogany table. One is his own, with its polished surface cold and heavy, a testimony to the official version of history, the one with clear outlines and acceptable losses. The other, carefully removed from a worn cloth bag, belonged to another man, but holds the key to your father's unspoken truth. It seems to pulse with a life of its own. He takes a deep breath, slowly and steadily, the air filling his lungs like the first breath of fresh air after a lifetime spent underwater. He raises his eyes to meet Ms. reads, her patient and intelligent expression, an invitation to finally break the silence, and so she begins to speak. The story that unfolds is not the one he has told himself for decades. It is the story of two men, Corporal David Miller and Thomas Riley, their fates irrevocably intertwined on a muddy hillside far from home. With every word, Jack dismantles the lie in which he lived, ensuring that Corporal Miller's sacrifice is remembered in all its heroic context, and that Thomas Riley, his father, is finally, after a lifetime of being a shadow, known. The final image is one of serene and profound resolution. Jack sits on his porch, the familiar grey light of a late Ohio afternoon enveloping him like a soft blanket. The rain falls, a steady, percussive rhythm on the roof and the thirsty ground. For years, this sound had been a torment, a memory. But for the first time in his memory, the smell rising from the damp earth is not of mud and regret, not the cloying odor of things buried and left to rot. It just smells of rain, pure and simple, washing the dust from the leaves and the bitterness from your soul. The world is being cleansed, and in the silence of his own heart, a son has finally and mercifully brought his father home.